thank you very much for having me, and thank you everybody for spending a day ahead of the major, coming together to learn and to talk about some important issues in our esports world. I think forums like this are so critical and so important when it comes to upping our game around every single industry, so I appreciate it, and I appreciate you for coming. So this is going to be slightly fluffier than a talk that focuses on the business and figures of esports. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about storytelling. I stood on this stage a year ago and talked a lot about comparisons with traditional sports and how esports measures up. And today we're going to be taking a slightly different journey through storytelling. I think we all know who I am at this point. My name is Nicola Piggot, and I'm the co-founder of the Story Mob, which is the world's first esports communications consultancy. Prior to that, I also worked as esports comms lead for Riot Games. So I'm going to let's just make a table stakes claim to begin with. Esports has redefined the way that we tell stories in today's sports industry. We all believe this. I believe to some degree, right? Esports athletes create completely unheard of connections with their fans, and the way that we consume and share stories has completely changed thanks to esports. So if we all agree that that's the case, what's more interesting to me is how we got there and where we go from here. So when I worked at Riot, Brandon Beck once said that the debate of is esports a sport didn't make any sense to him. He thought that sports wasn't even the right word to describe what we're doing. Maybe sports is just the closest word we have, right, to talk about what we're doing, this cultural movement which blends gaming, community, and technology and competition. Oh. Okay, so we're all familiar with the sports archetypes, right? From glory and defeat, to the hero, to the underdog, to the comeback. Hopefully, some of these faces are familiar to you guys. But if we take Brandon's words to heart, and we start to free ourselves from the expectation of what a sport is and what it should be, we're ready to take a bit of a closer look at what esports brings to the table. Like, yes, there's some excellent examples for us from the sports world about how we tell stories, right? We're human, we enjoy stories about sacrifice and struggle and skill. But what's interesting to me is, what can esports teach sports? What do we do better than sports does by itself? So I believe strongly that esports can teach so much about forging a connection with a fan base, right? A connection so strong that 99 million people tune in to watch a final, which, by the way, is more than the Super Bowl. So strong that if I'm a fan in New Mexico, I can put on the colors of my team that's based in LA or based in Germany and be just as proud as my father, who puts on the colors of a team that he's been following his whole life and that is from his hometown. So one of the things that mainstream culture, be it a talk show or your parents, right, has always struggled to understand is how esports can be considered here to stay because it feels so new. In a world where sports have centuries of history, esports is still a toddler. And this brings me to my first major recommendation. Immortalize your traditions. One of the reasons why celebrating our traditions and our history, even in our short shelf life, is so important is that, you know, even if we're not trying to court mainstream approval and point out that we haven't exactly just arrived, right? Competitive video gaming has been around in some form as long as video games have been around. But I believe strongly we should be playing an active part in creating our own mythology. If you think about the sports outside of esports that you love and you follow, right, you follow those moments from historical moment to historical moment. you celebrate each milestone along with your team and along with the players. And esports is starting to figure out how to do this, right? This can come in a big way, like the Esports Hall of Fame program, which is championed by companies like ESL. In fact, it was just awarded, I think, a couple of days ago to a StarCraft player named Boxer. It can also come through communications, right? We need to celebrate the traditions and key moments that make up our industry. I believe that as esports, we spend so much time celebrating firsts, right? The biggest tournament, the biggest investment, the first tournament in India, in wherever on Mars, that we don't spend enough time reflecting on our past. And I think there's a reason for that. So this is just an idea of like the first 4 years of League of Legends World Finals. I could have gone up to the current day, but that would be a lot of photos for one slide. And I think, as you see from the first year, your early days aren't always beautiful, right? Pros are sleeping on folding chairs, not in this photo, but in some tournaments that we've all known and loved. The broadcast may look jank. You may be running a team from a coffee shop with little to no idea about what you're doing. But we still need to remember, we need to create ceremonial moments so that we can look back and see how far we've come. Even in 4 years, right, the growth is staggering. And we're losing those historical moments if we don't take the time to pause and to immortalize them. This is a good example. So when Heroes of the Storm as a competitive esport, combusted earlier this year, a lot of teams, and I've just picked Liquid as an example, a lot of teams took the time to celebrate and to, immortalize the time and the successes that they had in the game. Yes, it's tinged with some regret and possibly even some anger, right, that this isn't a competitively viable scene anymore, but it remembers what we were all here for, those precious moments that made up part of the esports history that we all loved. So, we've talked a little bit about how limiting comparisons to sports can be. In the early days, it was very much how we defined our success, right? Can we stand alongside sports that have been here for 100 years and hold our head up and say that we are equal? We deserve as much respect, we deserve as much notoriety. But what's interesting to me now, that I've had some time to settle in, is we need to recognize not just what esports inherits from sports, but how much we're teaching them. Oh, hello. All right, spoilers, nobody look. Okay, so no one spends more time explaining esports to a mainstream audience than a communications person, right? Sports comparisons are a very easy crutch for us to use. We have established leagues, we have pros earning salaries that you might see in a traditional sport. But what we don't tend to talk about as much, and what I'd like to challenge us to talk about, are the areas where esports is not equal to traditional sports, it's superior. This is just one example. This was a piece with Wired and an LCS pro, a Cadian, and a regular guy. They were testing auditory and visual reaction time. And no surprise here, the LCS pro absolutely spanked the regular guy when it came to reaction time, right? But I'll tell you a small factoid later, but there are multiple instances where esports pros are superior to what you consider to be a traditional athlete, right? In terms of reaction time, in terms of the decision making and the wealth of information that they have to weigh up in a fraction of a second. So I think when we spend all this time talking about why esports athletes can stand shoulder to shoulder with traditional athletes, we may be doing them a disservice. Equally, when we think about esports, right, one of the things we're not fully exploring is how esports has the potential to reinvent what crowd participation looks like. And here we're only just starting to scratch the surface. This is a virtual clubhouse, a VR clubhouse that Optic experimented with earlier this year. It was basically a VR space where if I'm a fan of the team, I can come into this virtual space, enjoy the company of my fellow pros, my fellow fans even, and when the action happens, see it kind of crash through my virtual space as if I'm there. It's incredibly powerful, and this, again, is just the very first step. Just think about the possibilities of an entirely digital sport and how you can bring in an audience to that experience. This is something that sports does not have. Also, just think about, for a second, about the wealth of information that we have at our hands. I know Graham spent some time talking about data that's available within the esports space. But if you think about, in a millisecond of an esports game, there is reams upon reams of data to break down performance, to break down, all of the intricate details that make up a game. It's something that sports has never seen the like of, and it gives us a unique ability to really break down what key performance looks like, why somebody wins, and what are the factors that lead them to win. And I'm not even talking about stuff like digital revenue, all of the other things that esports can bring to the table, which sports, doesn't have a hope of matching. And that stat, by the way. So Doublelift, I'm going to go back so we're not distracted. Doublelift had, in the 2018 LCS Summer Finals, Doublelift had a game-winning play that meant that he had a reaction time of 0.25 seconds. And just to put that into context, the human blink is 0.4 seconds. Right? If you're a goalkeeper reacting to a penalty kick, that's 0.3 seconds. The amount of skill and precision that we're talking about with these esports pros is not only equal to traditional athletes, it's completely unheard of. So when I think about traditional sports, I think about a couple of things, right? Attendance at traditional sports events is down. Across the board, it fluctuates, but it's a pretty declining statistic. The younger generation is more geographically fluid. If I grew up in London, I do not live in London, right? So geolocation potentially is less of a big deal. And there's a large amount of traditional sports companies, the NBA, the Premier League, starting to dip a toe into esports. This shows me that esports has more to offer than just showing that it deserves to be at the table, right? Esports can create a bolder narrative. Not only do we deserve to be there, we deserve to be telling people about some of the amazing things that we're doing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about pros. I am such a huge fan of mythology around esports pros. I'm so excited to be on this stage, only for the second time, because this is where Faker had one of his favorite victories. And I think we all feel this way, right? Hero stories are bread and butter. We are drawn to stories of emotional hopes and emotional dreams. We want our esports athletes to look badass and for us to look up to them as the icons they are. Faker, on the throne, a couple of years ago, defending his title in the Korean League of Legends League. So cool, so awesome. He's the final boss. We're all very used to this kind of iconography, right? We're used to seeing these guys as untouchable heroes. I am absolutely not calling for an end to that. What I'm interested in celebrating too is the unique elements about these pros, the quirky, the endearing, the odd, the human, and yes, the nerdy, right? So let's take a look at another example that's trying to get the same effect, but doesn't quite get there. Oh, video, okay. Video doesn't play, but no big deal. What I was going to show you was an Overwatch intro, which is endearingly cringy, where clearly they have told the esports pros to come out and to make hero poses. We are working on it. Okay, let's see. It's pretty worth I wouldn't take up your time, but I think it's it'll pay off when you guys see it. Yeah, if you go back, go back one more. Okay, and then just click the title. That might do it. Oh, this has now been built up so much. Okay, yeah, it's worth. Let's check it out. So they told the Overwatch pros, and this is, to be fair, a very early event, but they told them to come out and give their own intro. Oh god. There we go. It's all about believing. That one's my favorite, by a very long way. Okay. So I'm not here to make fun of those guys. I actually think this is one of the most endearing clips I've ever seen in esports. I think there's such a sweetness and such a vulnerability to pros being who they are, right? Unapologetically, not, like cool, funny, awkward, nerdy, not untouchable gods. And I think, when I think about this, I realize that we're really sitting on a gold mine. Like, this is the first time an audience, a very specific audience of guys, as Ralph was saying earlier, that were made fun of growing up for their hobbies, has seen themselves reflected back, right? And they're not a punchline. They're heroes. They're celebrated. All of the things that made them self-conscious growing up are things that are reflected back at them and, held up as these amazing things. So I think when we talk about esports pros and the stories that they can tell, we're only just starting to scratch the surface. So for anyone unaware, this is Sneaky. Sneaky is 24 years old. He is the ADC for Cloud9. He is competitively, arguably, at the top of his game. He has represented his country multiple times. He is also an amazing cosplayer. His girlfriend is a makeup artist and a professional cosplayer, and he started earlier last year. He started debuting these amazing gender bender cosplay photos. So this blows my mind. I think this is amazing for so many ways. One of them, because this isn't something that he's doing as a joke or to be mocking, to make fun of himself. This is something he enjoys doing. In fact, when he was asked about it and asked about whether he'd ever been given any flack for doing this, he said most of the time he knows that his fans are seeing something new. So of course their reaction is going to be, what is this? He said, it's so cool that I get to explore, I get to expose closed-minded people to stuff that might make them more open-minded in the future. That seems like a pretty good direction for the human race. And I don't know about you, but I can't think of another sport in the world where this would happen, be celebrated, be talked about, and open up such interesting discussion. Like, imagine LeBron James doing this. Imagine Messi doing this. And talking about it seriously and perfecting, like, his cosplays are starting to get amazing. If you haven't checked him out, I would absolutely recommend that you do right after this. To me, it's one of the most inspiring things I've seen in a long time. And when I think about storytelling and pros, I think that, a lot of them are quietly doing this every day. Not this, obviously, this is an extreme example. But pros are, they're posting content that talks about their struggles with depression. They're connecting with fans and having real and genuine moments. They're memeing and flaming and trolling and just being unapologetically themselves. I think that pros are our greatest asset. And I think that we need to do a better job about capturing them not as untouchable heroes, but as the complex human beings that they are. Oh, okay. All right, so I'm coming on to my last point now. And one of the things that I see a lot in the esports industry is this belief that every esport is telling a very similar story, right? A story about, again, about universal truths of struggle, of overcoming the odds. And what I believe is that, just by the wealth of esports that are being played out over this weekend, we see that esports is such a blanket term, right? Esports are multidimensional. It is a multi-headed beast. Multiple sports that have multiple budgets, attitudes, ecosystems. We're not all telling the same story. So I think too often we try and paper over the differences and the intricacies between the ecosystem because we want to appear strong to a mainstream audience. And I think that we need to lean into the intricacies. I also think we need to be challenging ourselves to do better in multiple ways. And I'm going to tell you a story. This is the last story that I will tell. So this is Hungrybox, for anyone who doesn't know him. He's a Super Smash Bros. Player. This is him right after winning the Genesis 6 tournament in February. And there's two things that you can't tell from looking at this photo. One, that he beat I think it was a 16-year-old prodigy, and was so overwhelmed and admiring of his performance that the first thing he did after winning was go up and embrace the guy. And two, the entire, at least half of the audience for the entire time he was playing were shouting, "Fuck you, Hungrybox." Over and over and over and over. Now, there's a story behind this, obviously, which we don't have time to get into today. Super Smash Bros. and the whole community is an incredibly complex thing. He plays Melee and a series of unpopular characters, and there's been some other kerfuffles. But I'm struggling to think of any other sporting or professional environment in which that would happen. And while I think we need to be telling honest stories about what the community and what the ecosystems are like in each of our games, we also need to be challenging ourselves to do better, right? So I think that it's on us and on all of us to take an honest look at what happens in ecosystems that need to be challenged, that need to step up their game when it comes to basic things like sportsmanship. And it's also on us to be telling honest stories about that. I believe that Hungrybox would do well to go out there publicly and talk about some of these challenges, even though it might add fuel to the fire in terms of his detractors. I think that we owe ourselves to be telling honest stories about this. So I'll just wrap up quickly, and then I'm more than happy to take questions if there's any questions from the crowd. I believe really strongly when it comes to storytelling in esports that we're only just starting to scratch the surface. I think if we can get beyond the usual tropes, if we can cut ties to some of the sports influences that hold us back as much as they build us up, we have so much more to brag about than we have to prove, right? So esports really isn't going anywhere. I think it's really on us to be telling stories of the ecosystem that fully reflect it as this complex, wonderful, living community that it is. And that's it. This is my email address if anybody would like to continue the conversation over email. I'm more than happy to take questions, even though it's awkward because you guys are pretty far away. But
I
if you
can come
stick
to
a hand
you
up, I'll
if
take
you
it.
do. Nicola, Piggot, everybody. And do we have any questions for Nicola? We do.
Oh, good.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. I'm Matt, Galactus Pure. I have the extreme pleasure to doing a bit of the same business that you run, some marketing and brand communications. And the whole presentation was absolutely wonderful. I think that you've touched every and all of the bits that we've been all thinking about. But the last thing I had it back in my mind, and it somehow connected to the thing that you said just recently at the end of it, is that esports is grown and is somehow a grown-up person, because Pasha has children, Tas has a daughter. Isaac, the most famous Polish streamer and commentator, has just recently had a daughter. And I'm thinking if that's also an angle that we should also be touching as an industry, esports is finally grown up to become a real person with responsibilities. And that's my question to you. Do you think that we should also be talking about that as an industry, that we're no longer a younger industry? It's influential, but it also has a mission, responsibilities, and a happily future ahead of us. And I would love to hear what you think about that, and how should we approach that as an industry?
Yeah, thank you for the kind words, first of all. So I completely agree. It's so interesting to think about growth. And it's also so interesting because we kind of have like a Benjamin Button type effect, right? Like we have grown up so quickly in such a short amount of time that the changes that we see took other sports or other industries centuries to create. So I think talking about our growth and pointing out some of the areas that we have matured and that we have learned from our mistakes is so key when we think about talking about esports success. I think talking about what it takes to create, like, this is the first sport born into a post-internet world, right? There really is no precedent here. So talking about what it took to go from, season 1 worlds to season 7 or 8 or whatever season we're on now is such an incredible story of, just like, not just the growth of the community, but of us all. So I don't know if I'm answering your question sufficiently, but I do consider growth one of the most important storylines that we have. And I also believe that we should be talking about what we're learning, right? We're all learning so quickly. I myself, I've spent 15 years in communications. And the past 6 years that I've spent in esports, I have learned more than the previous years combined, easily, because I have had to keep up with such a fast-moving thing. So I think the more that we talk about how we're evolving, the more effective we're going to be. Does that answer your question? Okay, perfect.
Thank you for that. I have another question for you over here.
Hi, I'm Jendrik, and my question is that you said that it's hard to portray esports players as heroes, or maybe we shouldn't, but it's relatively hard to portray them anything else when they are coming out on a stage fighting for, I don't know, $1 million. So maybe the way we should go about it is maybe teach them how to look a little bit more as players, as champions. What do you think?
So I completely believe we should be portraying them as heroes, right? I didn't mean to confuse. I think, when I look at that picture of Faker on the throne, I feel such emotion. I feel such connection with him. I want to see him succeed. My point was more that in addition to them being, I would like us to make them a little more three-dimensional as we move forward, right? If you think about, okay, this is the most stupid analogy I'm ever going to make. But if you think about Batman, right? Think about the earliest days of Batman, right? He's super flat. He's a hero. He believes in virtue. He fights bad guys. Go Batman, right? Think about Batman now. This three-dimensional, dark, but, troubled, but also virtuous, striving to do the right thing, a hero, an anti-hero, struggling for redemption, like all of the things that we now associate with Batman, that to me makes my connection with the character that much deeper. So when I talk about pros and their hero narratives, what I want is for us to be adding to those hero narratives, right? To give these guys an opportunity to really show who they are. I remember when we were taking hero photos of the pros before LCS. A couple of them complained because they said, that the process is always the same, like 1, 2, game face. And some of them for some of them, that's their reality, right? They're these stern guys. But for some of them are goofy, some of them are shy, some of them are, happy. There's a whole rainbow of experience in that. I think we're getting better at showing it, but I would like to see us continue to explore the complexities. Make sense? Okay.
Thank you, Nicola.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm from Argentina.
Hi.
And my name is John, and I wanted to ask you because it was really interesting your talk. And what's for you the solution for esports teams to overcome the problem that people tend to follow more the players than the clubs? What's for you that storytelling that clubs needs to overcome that? Because as following what you were telling about Batman and looking at a hero, how will you achieve to make a club, an esports club, a hero?
Right. Yeah, I'm a Batman fangirl, not a DC fangirl, right? So yeah, I hear what you're saying. This is actually a very popular topic of conversation at the moment. I was just talking about it over dinner last night. I think for each team, it's going to be a little different, right? I think probably on balance in esports, fans follow player brands more than they follow team brands, which is a problem for a team, right? Because if you take on a star player and then 2 years later they go to another team taking all of their brand following with them, that's not a great investment on your side. I think teams need to address this in a couple of ways. They need to be creating really strong brands that are sort of their own brands, right? So if I'm a Team Liquid fan or a TSM fan, that needs to mean something to me outside of just the players, right? It needs to mean a community. It needs to mean a storyline and a history. This is why I'm talking about history and tradition, right? I think the reason why you support the Yankees is because you've been there year on year, because you are part of building that history with them. They are your team. They belong to you. And I don't think we're quite there yet in esports. But I do think that some teams are starting to break that barrier a little. I think it comes with, good leadership voices. Like Carlos of G2 is a great example, right? Like a hugely inspirational dude who's also, he representative of the brand. I think it comes with, really spending a ton of time talking to the community and creating loyalty. I think pros are always going to be superstars, are always going to carry, the weight of community. But if you think about, so to give another traditional sports analogy, if you think about like Michael Jordan, right, and the Chicago Bulls, when I think of the Chicago Bulls, I think of Michael Jordan, but also vice versa, right? Like he did some of his greatest, most iconic work with that team. And even when I see him later in his career, if he's doing something else or signed to another team, I think that's the Chicago Bulls guy. And that, I think, is the narrative that teams ideally want to have when it comes to their star players. Star players are always going to take the limelight, but the team brand should be, stronger just to have fans year on year. Cool.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those questions. And thank you, everybody, again to Nicola Piggot of the
Thank
Story
you,
Mob.
everyone.